Ні, так, ну, беріть.
Так, я за. Все. Починаємо. Ще чекай.
10 розпочнемо, бо вони щось.
Третій.
¿Qué tal? Encantado de ir con él. Trabaja en la delegación europea hace un año, un par de años. Pues encantado. ¿Y qué temas lleva?
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Please take your seats. We will start in 5 minutes. Thank you. Шановні учасники конференції, будь ласка, займайте свої місця. Ми розпочинаємо за 5 хвилин. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We will start in 1 minute. Шановні учасники конференції, будь ласка, займайте свої місця. Ми розпочинаємо за хвилину. Все, будемо починати, бо вони все одно всі не сядуть, поки ми не почнемо. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today we have the Day of United for Justice Summit, But we also have a very important thing to talk about. And there are 2 discussion panels, coffee break, closing remarks, and lunch ahead. And we are ready to start our first panel. But before that, please stand up to remember those brave Ukrainians who lost their lives in this cruel war. Thank you. And our first panel is probably about the most brutal crimes, war crimes of Russians. It's about children, our children, victims of Russians' attempted destruction of Ukrainian identity. And moderator of this discussion is Masha Efrosinina, activist and founder of Masha Fund. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bogdan. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I see that we have some chairs free, so breakfast one. But thank you for being here in a very, very important theme. I think that I was personally waiting very much. I'm a mom of 2. And I remember 24th of February, these first moments when I heard explosions in the street, and the first thing I thought about were, of course, my children. Every mother in Ukraine, each mother in Ukraine still thinks only about the safety of her child. But unfortunately, not every one of them could defend their children. So today is the 5th of March, as you all know. But here in Ukraine, we can do the minute of silence every date, because every date of the past city brought deaths of our children. The 5th of March 2022 killed 6 children, 6 Ukrainian children, and 8 of them were injured. And since that time, every day, all these tragedies for Ukrainians, these are tragedies. They just increase. So, Russia's military aggression against Ukraine in 2014, including full-scale phase, started 24th of February 2022, affected 7 million children in Ukraine, including 163,000 those with disabilities. Can you make, please, something with my microphone? 3 million children inside Ukraine and over 2.2 million children in refugee hosting countries are now in need of humanitarian assistance. Almost 2 out of every 3 children have been displaced by fighting. UNICEF research has shown that some 5.3 million of them face barriers to education, with an estimated 3.6 million directly affected by school closures. Because of this, children of Ukraine risk losing critical years for learning and social development. To date, more than 2,600 cases of war crimes committed by the Russian military against our children are being investigated. Now I want to present you all the speakers of today's panel because we will talk about the scale of war crimes against Ukrainian children committed by the aggressor. Deportation, transfer or kidnapped Ukrainian children to Russian citizens for upbringing, their adoption, destruction of the identity of Ukrainian children, and so on and so far. So please welcome Victoria Litvinova, Deputy Prosecutor General, Daria Gerasimchuk, Advisor, Commissioner of the President of Ukraine for Children's Rights and Rehabilitation, Tamar Tomashvili, International Expert, Professor of International Law, Caitlin Howarth, Director of Operations for the Conflict Observatory of Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, and Valentina Potapova, Head of the NGO Center for Civic Education, Almander. But first, please have a look at our screens. We have some video for you.
Коли ти ростеш, увесь світ навколо одна велика ігрова кімната.
When you're growing up, the world is a big playroom. We explore it with my friends and we discover something wonderful, new, exciting day by day. But one morning, the world has changed. We heard the explosions and air raids. I saw my mom crying, my dad be nervous. I was scared a bit too. Many of my friends have left abroad and I miss them so much. I miss playing with them. But now we have other games. We play armed forces, we play first responders, we have checkpoints. Over the last year, I've learned a lot. I know the safest place in our apartment. I know how to hide in the bomb shelter. I do my homework there. My mom says I'm doing well with my studies to grow up smart and to be helping people. I will do just that. I haven't chosen a profession yet, but I know that I shall live in Ukraine. And we will drive all our enemies ours. There will be no explosions. There will be a world to discover with my friends.
Russia took childhood from our children and continues doing this. That's why we need your support and your help in the decision of very huge problems connected with the deportation and all the crimes that Russia, this terrorist country, is doing with our children, with our future. Я звертатимуся до першої спікерки, пані.
I would like to address our speaker, Victoria, in Ukrainian, so please use the headsets. So, Victoria, over these 3 days, we've talked a lot about what can the law do for us? What can the legal instruments do for us? You've talked a lot about the operations of the prosecution office, the support you're giving, but I think it's so much harder when it pertains to the children. The topic of children is underrepresented. It's seen as secondary. But if we look at the problems we are articulating, it seems to me that the problem goes much deeper, so much deeper. Please share with us. Thank you, Maria. To address your question, I would like to say that the safeguards and the standards of the international law put in place after World War II could not contain the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And the humanity knows a number of wars, and we usually say that wars afflict all, but any war afflicts children disproportionately. In 1996, Gresham Marshall, representing his report before the United Nations, stated that in the context of war, children are the key victims of the armed conflict. Understanding this, we daily collect the evidence to make sure all the perpetrators, all the occupiers are accountable for the crimes committed amongst the most vulnerable population of the civilian, the children. We are now documenting 6 grave violations of the international humanitarian law that are committed against the Ukrainian children. It is killing and torture and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, denial of humanitarian access, abductions of children, recruitment and use of children, and finally, attacks on schools, hospitals, protected children's infrastructure. We are currently investigating around 2,600 criminal proceedings of crimes committed against the children. I would like to say that according to our estimates, there are many more crimes, and the real scale will only be seen following the occupation of some territories, especially those that have been occupied since 2014. Hundreds of children died during the bombings, rocket and artillery attacks. According to our data, 462 children have been killed. Just yesterday, when the wreckage was cleared after a residential building destroyed by a missile in Zaporizhia, a body of a 7-month-old baby was discovered. Executing children at point blank from an armored personnel carrier. Is this something that you can fathom in the modern day and age? This is not something that should happen in the modern day and age, but for the Russian military, it's permissible. The aggressors use a variety of means to kill the Ukrainian children. These are the twin boys from Mokhnatin in Chernihiv who were executed at point blank by the Russians. They were walking down the street to help their friend. They were shot at from the fighting vehicle. Even the fact that the boys raised their hands did not help them. It did not save their lives. During the occupation, the territory of Ukraine, Russia has systemically violated the agreements made about the evacuation and humanitarian corridors. These should be a safety road for the Ukrainian families, but these have become the roads to hell. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have shot at 100 civilian vehicles, trying to take their children to safety, but the aggressor didn't leave them a single chance. In the occupied settlements, the Russian servicemen have created and fabricated a humanitarian catastrophe. There was no water, food, electricity, heating, light. Babies were deprived of baby food. Children with special needs could not get their medications in time. To give you an example, an 8-year-old Alexander was wounded and for 2 days was bleeding in a shelter because the Russian servicemen were not allowing to take her to hospital. Later on, her life was saved, but she had to sacrifice her arm. Maiming. Since the 24th of February 2022, 931 child was wounded and maimed. One reason why the children are maimed is the detonation of improvised explosive devices and mines. There are cynical cases when the mines are disguised as toys and left on the playgrounds. For decades, still, we'll have children casualties when children detonate on mines, because children discover the world and they cannot fathom, they cannot fully understand the danger lurking, that the occupiers can lay their traps with such cynicism and brutality. But some crimes committed by the Russians are particularly heinous. We heard about the crimes, the victims of the crime of sexual violence and the unthinkable experiences that they have gone through. But there are 13 children amongst them, and the youngest child is just 4 years of age, and it's not just the girls who are afflicted. Considering particular sensitivity of the topic, the real scale of the crime will only be discovered years later. I would like to talk about the forced displacement and deportation of the children. There are now not just the prisoners of war of Ukraine in Russian captivity. We're checking the information about 16,000 displaced Ukrainian children who've been deported by the Russians. What's happening to them? The forced Russification, and that means destroying the Ukrainian identity of our children. We have recorded the cases when the children were separated from their parents, when children were documented as orphans, when their parents were taken to the filtration camps. At that, the leadership of the Russian Federation is enacting laws now allowing the Ukrainian children to receive Russian citizenship through the simplified procedure. This will mean that in future these children will be adopted into the Russian families and will lose or be rather deprived of their culture and identity altogether. It is particularly cynical that the adoption policy and foster placement of the Ukrainian children is exercised by the top political leadership of Russia. The ombudsman of the Russian Federation for the Rights of the Children is openly stating that she is bringing up a Ukrainian boy in her family. But worst of all is that the return of the Ukrainian children is an extremely difficult procedure, and now we've only been able to tear 307 Ukrainian children from their grip. The international humanitarian law recognizes the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict as one of the gravest violations. The Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 51, prohibits any pressure or propaganda aimed to recruitment of children in the involuntary enlistment, but there's evidence showing that the children are embroiled in military conflict. They are forced to staff the checkpoints. Children, out of fear for their life, help the Russians by bringing foods. They're used as spies for some promises. Children become the victims of the recruitment of the Russian military. The educational facilities are repeatedly attacked. They come under repeated attacks of heavy weaponry, aviation, missiles, the destruction of the hospitals. Schools is a separate war crime. Currently, 3,000 schools have been destroyed, creating obviously barriers to education, invariably depriving children of the access to education altogether. This is my school in Kostiantynivka in Donetsk region that I did my 11 years of study. This is where my memories belong. As a mother of two, I would like to say, day by day, when I leave for work, my children tell me they don't want to continue learning remotely. They want to go to school. They want to be with their friends, because for 2 years in a row, they've been deprived of the chance to be with their classmates. The international humanitarian law sets the duty on the occupying power that has occupied a certain territory to promote proper operation of the educational institution. And there is a special provision that education shall be provided, if possible, by persons of their own nationality, language, and religion. So that's Ukrainian nationality, language, and religion for us. But the Russian occupiers does not recognize Ukrainians as a peoples, as a nation. The president of the Russian Federation has underscored that Ukraine is a fabricated state, that Ukrainians do not exist as a nation according to him. All the narratives have been promulgated from the first days of the occupation. Denial of the schooling in Ukrainian, replacement of Ukrainian course books with the Russian, retraining the Ukrainian teacher, and replacement of the Ukrainian teachers. And that has manifested in the law enacted on the 15th of February this year, setting for the education in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson regions under the Russian standards. The occupiers are introducing the Russian standards for education. This constitutes their violation of international humanitarian law, but it is not seen as the grave violation, but we are recording the violation of the provisions across all territories, and this aims to destroy the Ukrainian language, culture, traditions, and altogether of the Ukrainian identity. The consequences of all wars, and I will say so wrapping up, leave a trace on the people who have survived, but also leave traces on the next generations. Therefore, the key enemy for Russia are the Ukrainian children. The Ukrainian children that are the backbone of our nation. This shows the deliberate destruction of our children, physically, morally, intellectually, mentally, but we shall persevere with the collection of evidence of international crimes committed against the Ukrainian children to lift the immunities at the highest level. We shall make sure that all the perpetrators who have planned, organized, and committed the crimes against children to account. And in future, we shall seek the international mechanism for bringing accountability, for bringing Ukrainian children home, to making sure that every Ukrainian child can have a future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Litvinova, for such a comprehensive presentation. There's nothing to add there, but I always keep thinking to myself when I hear about these horrible, horrible facts that in just one instance, it can transform from just numbers and facts in one moment. It can transform into something where we imagine our children being there. Ukrainian mothers are living through this horror for more than a year. And so processing this data, analyzing this data, imagine your own children. Ms. Litvinova has spoken about quite a couple of issues, and then we'll try to talk in more detail with different speakers about these issues. I would like to address Ms. Daria Gerasimchuk, the Commissioner on Children's Rights. Ma'am, you are the Commissioner of the President of Ukraine on Children's Rights. You know about the violation, instances of violation of children's rights, and you know what types of violation Russia is committing all throughout the full-scale aggression, and even starting from 2014, you know the scale of these crimes. And we have seen the numbers right now. So what do you think? Can all these children be considered the victims? And can we expect accountability and justice? Thank you, Masha. I'm looking at the audience and I see a lot of tears right now, but I would like to ask you, despite hearing horrible stories today, please take them in, but do not cry, because when a person cries, they are unable to make decisions and mobilize their efforts adequately. But this is exactly what we all need to do today. We need to mobilize our efforts to save every single Ukrainian child. Today, just like always, I will be trying to share the stories of the children, give the floor to the voices of the children, because unfortunately, some of the children from my stories will never be able to speak again. In reality, nothing is impossible. And everything is possible when we're talking about justice. These theses have to become our main goal when we are looking for mechanisms to bring the Russians to justice for the crimes that they're committing against Ukraine and Ukrainians, against humanity and human beings at large, especially when we're talking about the maimed face of Ukrainian children. It is said that human consciousness cannot accept large numbers. The larger the number, the harder it is for a person to understand what exactly it means. And today, we're talking about more than 7.5 million Ukrainian children. 7.5 million Ukrainian children who were residing in Ukraine prior to the beginning of the full-scale invasion on February 24th last year. Why? Because every single child out of the 7.5 million has become victim of this horrible, brutal war. Even if the child was not physically wounded, even if they were not murdered and were able to survive, even if they were not tortured or were not sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, every single child has been mentally traumatized because they have heard air raid sirens, they have been hiding in the shelters and basements, they were forced to be displaced to other more safe regions of Ukraine or become refugees abroad, hiding from the airstrikes and other types of strikes delivered by the enemy. And of course, many children are going through stress due to the fact that either one or both of their parents are currently defending the country on the front lines. They're praying and worrying for their parents every single day, expecting their parents to finally come home alive. So we can confidently say that this horrible war is violating every single right of the Ukrainian child. There's not a single right that is not being currently violated, that is not being taken away. In reality, we're talking about the fact that the lives of Ukrainian children will never be the same again. The schools, the kindergartens, playgrounds, and hospitals have been destroyed. Families have been torn. Lives have been destroyed. The lives of tiny Ukrainians, a lot of whom haven't really experienced life yet. For example, the life of one of the youngest victims of this horrible war, a boy named Serhiy. He lived for only 2 days. He didn't even live long enough to get his birth certificate. He was killed by a Russian missile in the delivery hospital. No, I'm wrong. He was killed by the Russian missile in the delivery ward of a hospital. Those are two different things. Just imagine, 2 a.m., his mother has just finished nursing him, and she placed him in the cot. And right then and there, a Russian missile struck the delivery ward of that hospital. Fortunately, there were just 2 of them on that floor. The 2 patients of that hospital on that night. The rescuers were able to recover the mother from the rubble alive, but the boy was killed. His father did not have a chance and will never have a chance to meet his son. It has been 9 years since the beginning of the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. And back then was when we started counting these horrible numbers, the number of children who were victims of this war. Over the course of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation of Ukraine, more than 1,500 Ukrainian children have become victims. Those are the children who were wounded or killed. But as my colleagues have told us today, that number is not complete, because we will definitely know a lot more horrible instances, horrible stories when all of the Ukrainian territories are deoccupied. However, as of today, we can confidently say that those are not numbers. Behind every one of those numbers, there is an entire universe that was destroyed by Russian government, by the Russian military. Russia is attempting to steal and deprive our children of their childhood and deprive them of the future, and deprive our country of the future. Russians have a plan, have a pre-planned policy in regards to our children. Their acts are not chaotic in nature. We have witnessed that since the beginning of the annexation of Crimea. All of us remember when the Russians organized the so-called Train of Hope that they used to transport the residents of the Russian Federation to the annexed peninsula. Those Russian residents who wanted to illegally take into their families Ukrainian children, and they continue to implement this plan. They have more technologies, they have more methodology, and they continue to systematically implement this plan. International humanitarian law qualifies mass deportation and forced trafficking of children as a war crime. But if we add to that the instances of murders and maiming of children, forced placement of children into Russian families, if we add to that the fact of forcing children to study Russian language, culture, history, and complete prohibition of everything Ukrainian, we are talking about nothing else than the crime of genocide against Ukraine that is committed through Ukrainian children. Every day in the media of the occupier state, there are a number of statements saying that they have deported or forcefully displaced thousands of Ukrainian children onto the territory of Russian Federation and onto the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. Of course, these numbers are presented as a very honorable act, as they are saviors of Ukrainian children, and they call that process evacuation. Of course, the entire global community understands that this is not evacuation in any shape or form. It is nothing else than deportation and forced displacement, and in simple words, abduction of Ukrainian children. Today, from the Ukrainian side, all of the instances that come to light are being published. We document all of them on the unified state platform called Children of War. All of this data is updated every morning, and as of today, as my colleague has said, we have 16,221 child that we know of who have been abducted to the Russian Federation, the Republic of Belarus, or forcefully displaced to the temporary occupied territories. Yes, it is absolutely clear to us that that number is not conclusive. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of abducted Ukrainian children. But I would like to confirm that we're able to bring back home only 307 children. But those 307 stories that were told by the children after being returned from displacement or forceful deportation allowed us to analyze the mechanisms that the occupiers are using in regards to our children. And according to our analysis, currently Russians have at least 5 scenarios of abducting Ukrainian children. The first scenario is when they first murder the parents and then abduct the child. That was what happened with Ilya from Mariupol, who together with his mother was running towards the shelter, towards the apartment of their friends, but they weren't able to reach that house. They ended up under the shelling. Ilya has had his leg wounded, and his mother had her head wounded. And that's just Masha talking to what Ukrainian women are feeling. Can you imagine that woman having a serious wound to her head? She has gathered all of her strength and she has pulled her wounded child to her friend's apartment. There were 2 of them in that apartment, but very shortly the woman died in the embrace of her 12-year-old son. Later on, the Russians abducted him from the family of their friends and forcefully displayed him to the occupied territory of Donetsk, where they wanted to amputate his leg, but we were able to bring him back home to his grandmother, bring him back home to Ukraine, and our doctors, our angels in Okhmadit hospital were able to save his leg. However, this is not a happy end story, because it is unfathomable what that 11-year-old boy has gone through. And saying goodbye to his mother and being there in captivity. The next scenario is when Russians are tearing children out of their families during the filtration, when they arrest the parents for one reason or another, and then they transfer the child onto temporary occupied territories and deport the child later on to the Russian Federation to be placed into a Russian family. And they confidently say that to children. You will hear a story of Sasha, 11-year-old boy from Mariupol, who today will tell you his story. And you will hear it from him. We're also talking about the third type of scenario, where Russians are taking the children from their families. Sometimes they use it as a weapon against uncomfortable adults who refuse to cooperate with the occupiers. So they're deprived of their parental rights, and the child is just torn out of the family or from their older siblings. And they're also brought to Russian Federation through the route that I have already mentioned. The fourth scenario is when they're removing children from the orphanages and different types of similar institutions. First, they prevent Ukrainian side from evacuating their children. They never agree to arrange humanitarian corridors. They do not allow us access to our children to provide them any type of humanitarian aid. And of course, our end goal is to bring these children to a safe Ukrainian territory, but Russians are preventing us that access, and they abduct those children. And the fifth scenario is the most widespread scenario, is when the Russians create absolutely unsuitable conditions on the occupied territories for the existence of children, and then they offer parents to willfully surrender their children to go to a camp on the territory of the Russian Federation, a recreational camp. Why did I say that it is usually done forcefully is because the parents are threatened in those cases that they will be deprived of parental rights if they do not give their child up. And of course, after these camps, children never return home. Those are the five scenarios, at least five scenarios, that we are fully aware of that Russian Federation is relying on. Also, Russians are doing everything possible to prevent the child from going back to their parents, to their biological parents. They take their phones away right on. They prevent the child from notifying their parents or anyone on the Ukrainian territory about their location. When we are asked, do you know where your children are? No, we do not. This is truly extremely difficult to identify where the child is, to find that child. We're constantly making efforts in that regard, but unfortunately, as of today, there are only 307 children that were brought back. And that is because Russians are hiding these children all across the Russian Federation territory. They're purposefully spreading those children all across the territory of this neo-Bolshevik empire, and they keep moving those children across the country. And so when we are able to finally grasp the location, they are transporting the child to a different location again. Today, we have a clear understanding that there are many of those stories. I constantly talk to children, and I can share many of their stories, but I want you to focus on the fact that the most important thing for us to do together right now is to most efficiently and effectively react to this heinous crimes, the crime of genocide against the Ukrainian people committed through Ukrainian children. Our goal is to immediately stop the forceful displacement and deportation of Ukrainian children. It is not enough to talk about it. We have to stop it. We have to recover all of our children as soon as possible on those territories that we have no access to. And that's what we need your help with, the help of the international community. We have to bring back our children as soon as possible and ensure unification of them with their biological families as it goes to the best interest of the children according to the international humanitarian law. I'm convinced that we will not be able to eradicate evil from the human beings as such, even though we might want to. But it is in our power to prove with our words and most importantly deeds that the light in humanity will prevail. I would like to draw your attention to the screen because right now we will show you the video testimony of the 11-year-old Sasha from Mariupol. Of course, he agreed to this, and his guardians have also agreed to making this video, but I want to explain to you why he wanted to show his face. We offered him to blur his face or to film from the back, but Sasha told me in person that he has this strange idea. He thinks it's strange that what if his mother there in the filtration operation, she was just bitten up so badly that she lost her memory, and what if she sees this video and she will remember her son and she will definitely come back, which is why you see this video with no blur and his face is right there. Please look at the screen. My name is Sasha. I'm 12 years old. And since March of last year, I have been looking for my mom. Her name is Snezhana Kozlova. We were separated in the filtration camp in the village of Bezemenna. The Russians were telling me that my mother didn't need me anymore, and that they would send me to a foster home in Russia. Imagine they didn't even let me say goodbye to my mom. We had no electricity, no gas, no running water. We were just standing there by the grill outside making food because it was impossible to make food inside. And then the shelling started. I heard this explosion and I was deafened by the explosion. And then I felt something burning. I felt like a hot fragment. I was screaming to my mother that my eye hurts. And my mom grabbed me and took me between the garages to hide. And we were waiting there till the shelling stopped. And then my mother and I were looking for some medical aid to help my eye. And we went to the elite steel factory. There were military medics inside. They disinfected my eye, and we stayed there with them at the plant. But the soldiers at the plant were running out of ammunition, so we were all taken hostage. The Russian military put us in Kamaz trucks like animals and took us to some hangar. I sat there at the filtration camp waiting for my mom to come back for a couple of hours, but she never came back, and they didn't let me say goodbye, and they told me that I was being taken to the orphanage, and then there will be a Russian family that will adopt me from there. In Novozovsk, the doctors told them to bring me to Donetsk. And just a month later, I finally was able to ask for a phone, and I ran to the toilet to call my grandma just for 1 minute, and I told her where I was. There has been no communication with them since February 24th. I was worried sick, and I couldn't understand where my children were that were in Mariupol back then, but I was waiting. I was hoping that someone will call me. On April 19th, I got a call from an unknown number. And I asked who that was, and it was Sasha. He told me, "Grandma, please take me away from here." And I said, "Sasha, I will come get you. Just wait for me, please." I started collecting the documents to come get him. People were trying to persuade me not to do that. They said, "Oh, they're going to put you in jail. They're going to detain you." And how could I not do that? There was my grandson right there. He was waiting for me. I have to go. I waited for a month for my grandma. And I thought maybe my mom will finally come, but my mom never came. And when my grandma arrived, I was worried that they would separate me from her just like they did with my mom. We were so overwhelmed with emotion. We were crying from joy to finally come together. I took him home and I brought him to my house. But we are still waiting for Snezhana. We are hoping that she's still alive, and we are looking for her. We hope that she will finally come back to Sasha, and I will be so happy together with my children. If the whole world could hear me, I would tell them that we have to win this war as soon as possible. For all the children to come home to their parents, for all of the parents to return home, to finally hug their family, and for all to finally be well in this country and in the whole world. Masha, if I may finish my presentation, I would like to once again remind you what we started with. What this boy wanted to say, if all the world could hear him. I really hope that today the entire world heard him, because you will come back to your home countries, you will come back to your jobs, and you are the people who are able to change so many fates of Ukrainian children. And today, I want for each and every one of you, each and every one of us, to think about what can we do and what do we have to do to save every single Ukrainian child right now, because tomorrow, those can be the children of any other country, any other child. And as long as Ukrainian children are in danger, no child can feel safe in the entire world. Thank you so much.
This year, I have traveled across Europe on many occasions, speaking at rallies, speaking at conferences, speaking to people. Ukraine is visible these days. Ukrainians are also visible because you can see it in their eyes. You think you've cried out all your tears, but they still come. So there is much work for us to do, and now I would like to transition to our next speaker, Tamara Tomashvili.
Could you describe, please, the legal framework applicable to children in situation of an armed conflict? How could we qualify violation and crimes witnesses in course of armed conflict in Ukraine?
Thank you, Maria, for the question. I think it would be very difficult and emotional for us to frame all the notions from the legal perspective, but I think for justice to be served and those who commit these crimes to be accountable, it's something that has to be done now. So it's not late tomorrow. Yesterday, when the Prosecutor General opened the conference, he said that Ukraine is fighting for the better future. And I think there is no person in this room who wouldn't agree that children are the future of Ukraine? Children are the future for every country. Children are the backbone of Ukraine, as Victoria also noted in her presentation. But also, I think more importantly, and both Maria and Victoria also mentioned their mothers, and I joined them in this session, being mother too. There is this thing within the parents that children are everything. This is irrational love and irrational hope. And the only way to move forward is to do everything which is possible for these children. That's why I will try, perhaps in this presentation, to outline three things. First, as Maria mentioned, what are the legal dimensions, legal framework that we can look at? Second, perhaps try to classify some of the acts mentioned by Victoria as well as Ms. Herasimchuk in her presentation. And lastly, if the time gives us the opportunity, or perhaps we leave it out, speak also about the institutions and the accountability mechanisms can be used. So the legal mechanisms and international legal framework, I think, with respect to the protection of the children is quite broad. Both Ms. Herasimchuk as well as Victoria also mentioned international humanitarian law. I would add also international human rights law, and I think particularly it will be important and relevant legal framework when we talk about the education component carried out by the Russian Federation in occupied territories as well as in Russian Federation. And lastly but not least, of course, when we talk about the individual accountability, it relates to individual criminal responsibility and individual criminal law. Now, I think what is also important to note that the safeguards are there. What is the momentum now is to effectively implement them. As Victoria mentioned, with respect to the children in armed conflicts, there is 6 directions of violence. Unfortunately, I think due to time limits, we won't be able to look at them all, but I will try to look at some of them, particularly mentioned by previous speakers. And undoubtedly, the first one will be forced deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia and in the occupied territories when there is a forceful displacement which is qualified as transfer. Ms. Herasimchuk very righteously noted it is often justified under the pretext of evacuation, and it's not the first time. It was actually one of the biggest challenges during the World War II. That's why when international community also adopted Geneva Conventions following Second World War, they specifically described the formulation about the evacuation, then followed up about the specific formulation about the children. Evacuation of the children is not justified unless it is carried out for the purposes of their security and for the medical reasons. And I think the fact that perhaps also we will hear from the other speakers presenting here some of the reports about existing practice with respect to summer camps organized by Russian Federation in occupied territories as well as in Russian territory proper, hint that taking kids without permission or in the situation of and in a context where the parents are threatened under the existing context of violence could rightfully qualify as a deportation or transfer. I think also what we could also see in these cases is accumulation of other crimes. For example, if the kids are staying in this so-called summer camps prolongedly without the consent of the parents, which was perhaps in some of the cases even not present at the beginning, it could also qualify as an unlawful confinement. Also, as Maria mentioned, I think Victoria mentioned in her presentation, it's very interesting to look at the forced deportation and transfer in conjunction with the policy. When kids, particularly who do not have parents, but could have legal guardians, are taken through the adoption process in the Russian Federation. And I think yesterday, Professor Payam Akhavan very rightfully put it, that it's very important to look at this crime in three prisms. One, undoubtedly, we say that there is a war crime. Second, I think it is a momentum now to look at it as a crimes against humanity. And I again echo what has been voiced by the Vice President Kamala Harris at Munich conference, that we are witnessing the commission of widespread and systematic violence against civilian population. We would agree that with the data provided by both presenters, as well as present perhaps in the small brochures that are that were put on your chairs, give opportunity to argue in this direction. But for me, it's clear that at this moment we're looking at a very specific type of policy that is carried out by the Russian Federation. And I think what is also important for us and the international community to reflect on, perhaps also coming from the Georgia, having somehow the similar history in my country, it didn't start really this kind of policy with respect to Ukrainians in 2022. It started in 2014. And there are facts and cases similar to that when we see that there are actions carried out, particularly to change demographic situation in occupied territories. I will move to the second example, which I wanted also to flag, and I think it's closely linked to this crime. Also, one of the 6 crimes mentioned by Victoria is recruitment of child soldiers. What has been a tendency by the Russian Federation since summer is carrying out perhaps a summer schools for the younger children and preparing for mobilization purposes. And there are documentation, official documentation issued by the Ministry of the Defense and public authorities, which show that there is a recruitment process undergoing. Also, I think it was mentioned by Herasimchuk, and I echo this fact. Recruitment of the child soldiers does not only mean that it has to be forceful. It's also a war crime when it is committed voluntarily by the child, just because he might be threatened or also doesn't really understand what's happening. I invite all of you to also perhaps then read a report prepared by Conflict Observatory, and Kathleen will be presenting it today. You will see there are the pictures of children in the summer camps with the public officials from the Russian Federation. And it will be interesting, I think, for all of us, despite the fact that they are anonymized, to look at the faces. Are they happy or not? For me, the challenge with the war crime of the child soldiers is that the tendency in these summer camps is also to not only re-educate, carry out Russian propaganda, but also in some of the summer camps they are carrying out so-called military training, teaching kids to shoot. When I will move to the third one, I see that my time will be soon up. Perhaps one issue that also flagged by Victoria, it relates to the children who are victims of conduct of hostilities. When we talk about the indiscriminate shelling, but also when we speak about the use of explosive weapons. And I think one challenge that Ukraine would have inevitably after the victory, when this war is over, is the landmines and the problem that the landmines cause. what is important is that even if the legal framework under humanitarian law is very specific towards the explosive weapons, it is possible to argue from the human rights perspective whether the existence of the landmines, leaving the landmines and not taking them violates human rights obligations of Russia. I know it sounds perhaps cynical to speak about the obligations of the Russian Federation, which has denounced this, basically does not comply with any obligations under any rule of international law. But if we want to preserve the international law, rule-based order, I think what the Ukraine is correctly doing is moving and using all the mechanisms. And with that, I will try to move to the last issue, which relates what are the mechanisms and instruments that can be used by Ukraine for the violation of the rights of the child from the accountability perspective. We have discussed yesterday, actually, the three pillars that has been presented by the Deputy Minister of Justice of Ukraine. And as she rightfully noted, there is the state responsibility area, which is now so vastly employed by the Ukrainian authorities, where Ukraine can seek responsibility of the Russian Federation for violation of the various treaty obligations. Unfortunately, it's difficult to address a lot of obligations before the International Court of Justice due to the fact that Russia doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of this court. However, Ukraine has shown, I think, bravery in being very modernizing I believe modernizing international law because of the fact that it has introduced the idea of compensation commission that existed before under the various international instruments, one of them being a compensation mechanisms existing following Iraq-Kuwait war. So perhaps from the state responsibility perspective, there is an opportunity to think about children as a very specific vulnerable group who could benefit from the reparation and compensation through the compensation mechanism. We also heard yesterday the Representative Director General of the Council of Europe in relation to the fact that as of at this moment, Russian Federation is not bound by European Court of Human Rights treaty. However, we all hope that there will be a momentum when the interstate cases that are before the court will be decided, and first of all, the result of these interstate cases will be acknowledgement of the violation of the rights of individuals, but at the same time giving a compensation. I think one of the directions also for the state responsibility that was not mentioned here is existing UN treaty bodies and UN mechanisms. It's worth employing them since Russian Federation is present in the United Nations, and it's important to make everything for them to be uncomfortable there. Last but not least, throughout the conference we talked about the individual criminal responsibility, and it's, I think, the vital, because as it has been mentioned in Nuremberg, states are abstract entities. They do not commit the crimes. It's the individuals who commit the crimes. And the justice and accountability can start by punishing those who committed war crimes against children. With that, I finish my presentation because I think I'm over the time.
Thank you so much. You are in time, absolutely, but most important that what you have said. Thank you, Ms. Tamar. Thank you for all your words. Now I'll pass the word to Ms. Kathleen Howarth. Ms. Kathleen, you represent an independent organization, the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale, which focuses its activities, among other things, on the problems of protecting the rights of Ukrainian children who ended up in the territories temporarily controlled by Russia. Could you please share the results of your research, which your organization published in February 14, 2023, under the title Russia's Systematic Program for the Re-education and Adoption of Ukrainian Children? I think it works.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for your eloquent words already this morning. You've already heard many of the findings from the report that were already shared, so I'm going to try to be a little bit brief and not rehash what you've already learned. The job of my team, which works with the Conflict Observatory, is to make sure that we are able to provide vigorously, deeply researched, and methodologically sound data that demonstrates widespread and systematic systems that Russia is perpetrating, and to essentially be able to demonstrate that in such a way that anyone is able to repeat our process and to come to the same conclusion. That's our job. We've done that job now in reports on filtration process that has been underway throughout the so-called DPR and LPR in Luhansk and Donetsk. We've looked at it in Kherson. We've been documenting extrajudicial detention and enforced disappearances. We've seen and documented the extensive and overwhelming targeted damage to Ukraine's health facilities, especially in Mariupol, in the very earliest days of the war. And we will continue to document damage to critical infrastructure and to crop facilities, where the impact of even light shrapnel can be enough to cause massive damage to Ukraine's critical infrastructure when it comes to crop storage and the ability to transport these key grains all across the world and also to your own people. That has ripple effects that truly cannot be overstated all around the world. The point of all of this, and the reason why we had to release this report on children's now, this was a tough one for us to do. And not just because of the subject matter, but because for any of our reports can be difficult to sort of wrap up because there is so much that is constantly coming in. We always know that we're doing our job if our research team is dissatisfied and constantly trying to force more data in up to the 11th hour. But this was particularly difficult. We had to make some tough choices. One thing we had to do with this report was to make a key decision early on to focus on children that were being sent to these so-called recreation camps. And that means that our number, the 6,000 number that many of you are familiar with, largely represents children from Luhansk and Donetsk, with also some children from Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kharkiv. So there are many children who are represented, but the majority do come from Donetsk and Luhansk. And because they come from those two occupied areas, that just needs to be understood, that this is, a fraction of a much, much larger system and a much larger story. And because it's so conservative, it's also important to understand that we chose to focus mainly on children who are being sent sort of for the purposes of recreation and with the explicit permission of their families, as opposed to children who were being explicitly deported or going through or who are basically going through more the filtration system for these, frankly, blatantly illegal adoptions and foster placements. That was a very tough decision to make early in the process. It does not mean that the data does not exist that thoroughly documents those cases. It simply means that we are still in the process of compiling it for the next report that will be released on this. And you've already heard much of that documentation from the other speakers here. So please know that we're working on just catching up to all of you. The reason why we felt that we had to report this now and with this level of urgency is because it bears repeating that some of the only people who are able to come and get some of their children out are the parents in these situations. And we felt that we owed the parents as much information as we could get them at this point in time, and that the emergency was growing to a really critical level. So it was with that in mind and with some consultation to our partners who work in the field in Ukraine that we chose to go forward at this time. But it's not a decision that's ever taken lightly. As many of you know, and as you experience in your own practices, I know for the other people who work in open source and other field research, anytime you choose to publish, you immediately fear that your sources of information will start to dry up and go away. That data will start to be disappeared off the internet, that people will stop talking. That is 1,000 times more true in this case. We are constantly looking for more information. We will continue to do so. And also, it's going to rely on so many of us to compile the existing research that we already have and to triple down on our efforts to collect more. There are more things that I could say, but I will not say in front of these cameras because of the sensitivities around that ongoing investigation. We also want to make sure that as we think about what these children have been exposed to, it can't really be overstated how insidious the re-education aspect of this is. It might seem as if it's an easy thing to sort of help your child get over the impacts of a program, especially if they were returned to you. But that's exactly what Russia knows how to do so well. These are programs that have been tested not just over a few years and not just on the Ukrainian population. They've been tried and tested over decades, really over the better part of the 20th century at least. You heard yesterday from the First Lady of Latvia how they were tested on Latvia's children, how these are programs that really have been used for so long. And the system itself, the system of camps, that actually goes back for at least to the Stalin era, these pioneer camps for Russia's own children's population. So this is something that feels very familiar because it should. It's something that's been well trodden. Because of that, it's important to, again, really provide some respect to what's going on here. These are tools that the perpetrators know how to utilize in the most effective ways. And I'll give you just a small sampling of what the Minister of Education, Kravtsov, had to say about the strategy they're utilizing. In describing some high schoolers who are participating in a university program, he said that they virtually rediscover Russia because it doesn't exist in this form. Many of them do not know that there was a time when we lived in one country with one culture, one common language. Yeah, they don't know that because, to use a very classical academic term, it's complete bullshit. It's important that we call it what it is. This isn't just propaganda, and it's not just simple reframing of somebody's point of view. It is disinformation. It is weaponized. And it is framed in a very specific way. It's framed in a way to make the lie sound like something that everybody can get behind, that it's all about unity, that it's all about coming together, that it's all friendly, and that the reality, the truth of an independent Ukraine, of a beautiful and unique Ukrainian identity and culture and language, that all of those things that make Ukraine special, that make these children special, that all of that, if you were to support that, well then suddenly that becomes synonymous with division and with standing apart. And now you're no longer part of the team. And now doesn't that make you no longer somebody who people want to associate with? It's a very clever strategy. And we need to stop thinking that it would be obvious to anyone, including ourselves, that we would be able to withstand that pressure. I mention that because it is important for everyone here, and I dearly wish that some of our friends in government were still here today, because they are the most important targets of Russia's disinformation campaigns. You are the most important targets of the propaganda. And don't believe for a minute that it doesn't work on us. Because every minute that we aren't taking action, every minute that we feel some doubt, some sense that we need to quibble over whether maybe we have to pause a second and think, well, is it technically an adoption or is it maybe a fostering? The children shouldn't be there in the first place. They're not supposed to be there in the first place. That's the simple truth. I am not a lawyer, but a fairly plain reading of the Geneva Conventions would tell you that in these kinds of instances, these children should be hosted by a third-party nation, that they should be in a registry, that they should be able to be contacted by their parents or extended families, that they should have easy access to communications, to call their families, that their families should know how to contact them, that their names shouldn't be getting changed. This is common sense. And it's not just common sense, but it's the law that Russia is party to. And we have to stay laser focused on that, because everything else, all the muddling, all of the sort of this and that and hemming hawing, that is us buying into their strategy. And we can't do that. And I hope this doesn't come across as me trying to be partisan, because honestly, this is me as a humanitarian. I would say this for any country, any nation that was engaging in these strategies. The lack of clarity is a major failing, I believe, of the international community. And it's easy to get buy into. Our own research team struggles with the same problems while we're researching this. And so with that, I just want to close with one last thing. If there's anything that you also take away from our research, and I hope you look at the report in full, it's that the parents are not to blame in all of this. And I hope you heard that from what the other speakers were saying. Parents who have been exposed to relentless amounts of information, relentless pressure from war, relentless pressure sometimes just at their doorstep with teachers telling them this is the only option for your child, it's the only place that's safe for them to go. Parents are not to blame. And parents need to be given every option to report that their children are not with them and that their child needs to come home. We have to meet their needs where they are and give them every ability to help us help them. With that, I'll hand it back to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your work. We're waiting for your further reports. Thank you very much for everything you're doing. В нас, на жаль, залишилося не так.
Unfortunately, we are very short on time. However, we have our last speaker. And I would absolutely love to talk to her about the changes that she had to face in practice, because we will be talking about Valentina Potapova. Up until 2014, she worked in Crimea. She was a teacher. She was a professor at the Department of History and Law, am I correct, right? Of the Crimean Humanitarian University. After the occupation of the peninsula, you dedicated your life to civil society activities, documenting the violations of access of Ukrainian children to education. As an educator, as a human rights advocate, could you tell us a little bit more what happens to the education of our children on the occupied territories starting from 2014? Thank you. I was listening to all of the people who are presenting at this panel today, and it brought me back to 2014, when in October of 2014, I made the decision that in order to remain safe, I had to flee my home. I was born in Crimea. I have been working in Yalta, and that was a very difficult decision to make. And I notified my students of this decision, and I have told them that I am leaving, because it is becoming extremely dangerous to stay there. And my students, they have told me on my way out of Crimea that we are not betraying the country by staying here. You are betraying by leaving us here. You're betraying us because you are an adult, you're a smart individual, and we do not know how do we survive here under occupation. It has been 9 years, and for 9 years, every single day, these words haunt me. And every single day, I keep trying to protect children who are remaining on the occupied territories. We have talked today about forceful displacement of children. 16,000 children are now in Russia, but for some reason we fail to mention that for 9 years, more than 1 million children every day are under very strong influence of Russian Federation in Crimea and in the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And now they're joined by the temporary occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts. I can give you this number on Crimea. There are 334,000 children from 0 to 15 years, 36,000 children from 16 to 18 years, 53,000 students who are now currently under this pressure. I've had my presentation, and I would really want to for us to take a look at the presentation and visualize which components Russian Federation is using in order to destroy Ukrainian identity of these children, and in reality to strip Ukraine of more than 1 million children. 1 million. And when we are talking on whether we should recognize this as genocide or not, I want to tell you that from the 7 million children that we have mentioned, 1 million is already taken away from us, because those children were unable to deal with the pressures they had to endure. And what are the components of this identity change? First of all, the children are deprived of their native language. Take a look at the numbers. Today, in Crimea, only 1 out of 100 children has access to Ukrainian language. 182 children are able to study in Ukrainian out of 283,000 school children. 3% of children have access to education and the native Crimean Tatar language. Secondly, as all of you have seen in Kherson and Zaporizhia, all of the Ukrainian history books are taking away, and all of the components of the Ukrainian culture education cycle, they're stripping everything Ukrainian. There's no cultural center where a child can go and learn anything, something about Ukraine, Ukrainian history, about the history of their own nation. It just doesn't exist. Yet other component. As a result of these demographic changes and as a result of many Russians moving into Crimea, the child ends up in an environment where if you say something about being Ukrainian, or if you in any way display a Ukrainian identity with yellow and blue stripe, you become the victim of bullying. And you're bullied not only by your peers, but you're also bullied by teachers. And this bullying from the teachers is the scariest thing. Also, the teachers who wanted to share something about Ukraine or who attempted to tell children about who they really are have been fired. And those teachers were replaced with the correct teachers, with the correct teaching approaches. And we saw that live, how the teachers were deported from Kherson and Zaporizhia to make sure they are re-educated and retrained on how to properly teach children on the occupied territories. I don't really see the slide, unfortunately. Could you go on with the next slide? The next are is the propaganda. And the propaganda has been reinforced most recently because if previously, together with the Regional Center for Human Rights, we have conducted a study on the narratives that are presented in the Russian history books and other books that Russia is using to teach Ukrainian children. Most of the narratives reflected what Putin said. It is strange, but I ask myself, if in the educational process of the Russian Federation, in the curriculum, there are two topics, world history and Russian history, where should Ukrainian history be? Well, probably in the world history, because Ukraine is a different country. No, there's no Ukrainian history in the world history class, in the world history curriculum. Well, maybe it's in the history of Russia. Yes, it is in the Russia history curriculum. But Ukraine there is only as a part of Russia. And according to these books, children are taught. Moreover, they're starting to implement the so-called ideological classes, where they talk about important things. And I'm going to quote a couple of those conversations. For example, Russia is ending the war now with its efforts. The peace on those territories will be ensured by Russian peacekeeping forces. The goal of this military operation is to eliminate nationalist ideology in Ukraine and restore trusting relations between our countries. All of this is being taught to children during these ideological classes, but this is not the half of it. That is where a very strong military patriotic education starts. This military patriotic education, this indoctrination of children, is actually implemented through the introduction of cadet classes. In Crimea, there's 128 cadet classes that are teaching 3,000 children. Let us compare that to the children who have access to Ukrainian language. 182 children against 3,000 children who are taught in these cadet classes. Those are the camps. There were quite a few of those camps set up this year. The next component is a so-called young army, the young army. I'm not going to elaborate on the young army because almost all of you know what this organization is. And this organization specifically is funded by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. Currently in Crimea, there are 184 offices of young army that are involving more than 30,000 children in Crimea to this movement. This system ensured 1 million children being stripped of their Ukrainian identity, being torn out of the Ukrainian context. And when we will come back to Crimea, it will be very difficult for us to communicate with the children who have become victim of this propaganda and this indoctrination policy. And to sum up my presentation, I would like to go back to the Nuremberg Tribunal. And I would like to remember the head of the Hitler Jugend, Arthur Askman. I was honestly impressed by the fact that this person, who was the head of the Hitler Jugend since 1940 till 1945, that person has gotten just 3 years prison time. And that person died in 1996. You can assume that person had a happy life, right? But that specific person was to blame for the fact that 600,000 of Hitler Jugend children were sent to defend Berlin when there was no one else to defend Berlin. And those children fanatically fought in the war. So I raise a question to the entire global community. I am no lawyer, but if we will not remember about the children that are left on the occupied territories every single time, just like I remember those students that were left behind in Crimea. I remember them every single morning because they told me that I betrayed them. I do not want for all of us to betray the children that are currently on the temporary occupied territories and who have to every day go through this indoctrination to make sure that later on they will be fanatically defending Russia in that last battle that they are forced to sing about. And I quite often remember the song that's very popular in Russia. And it's a children's song in essence. And it goes, and even in the last battle, Vladimir, we are with you. Can you imagine? They're not even fighting for Russia. I could understand if they were fighting for Russia, but they're being indoctrinated to fight for the leader, for that autocratic leader. They're forced to believe that they will have to die for Vladimir Putin. So I call upon all of us to find international mechanisms to stop this horrendous crime. Thank you. I would also like to add that they're forced to die for the dictator, for the tyrant, for the terrorists, which I'm pretty sure you have learned about being in this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank our speakers for the effort they have put in to actually stay within time limits, but they have also spent the entire time limit depriving us of time to ask additional questions. At the very least, you will be able to use a coffee break, and so I would ask our panelists, I would encourage them to stay in the coffee break area so you can use coffee break to discuss these issues, to ask additional questions in a non-formal setting. Because I think that all of you might have a lot of questions, more questions that you have had before listening to this panel, but those questions are extremely important. As you can see, this is probably the most emotional panel of the entire conference, because we are talking about children, absolutely defenseless little citizens of Ukraine. Who else can defend them? Who else can help them if not us? We owe it to them. We owe it to them to make sure that we don't betray them. So you get a chance to enjoy your coffee and talking to our amazing women. Please pay attention to the stand where there are these books displayed. This is a very interesting work of art. The only texts that are in there are the quotes of Ukrainian children. This is a book that was published by the charitable fund Voices of Children. It has been created with the quotes coming only from Ukrainian children, and every single page breaks your heart. But children never lie. They don't know how to. So, there's also a QR code on the back, and you can donate to Ukrainian children, and you can order this book, and you can buy it by donating. All of us are taking every single possibility to raise funds to help. Everyone needs help. The armed forces of Ukraine need help. The humanitarian needs to be covered. So you can use your presence in a multifaceted way. So enjoy your coffee, have a nice chat, and discuss these crucial topics for our country. Thank you all so much.
And for everything you have done and are doing for our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists. This is probably the most painful topic that has been discussed. In this room, we have 15 minutes left for a coffee break, and after this, we will continue with the last discussion panel of